Hello and welcome back to the channel. Today I wanted to take some time to explain why I became a Lutheran. Now, many of you may know from watching my previous videos that I was a Reformed Presbyterian. I was a confessional Presbyterian for most of my life. I was raised in a Presbyterian church, baptized as an infant in a Presbyterian church, and catechized and raised up in the Reformed faith. Now, this video is going to have some of my personal testimonial in it, or personal testimony in it. However, most of it is going to consist in why I changed my opinion on particular doctrines rather than, all the interpersonal stuff that happens when you go from one perspective to another. And when people who love you are concerned about you and where you're going, then sometimes hard conversations happen, right? But this video is not about that. It is about the theology behind my conversion, not the other personal aspects of the my change in theological perspective. And so right off the bat, I wanted to start with the doctrine of baptism, why my perspective on baptism changed. Now, there are multiple views of baptism within the Reformed world. There are views that are closer to the Lutheran perspective, and then there are views that are more low church and significantly farther away from the Lutheran perspective. But I'm going to do my best to present here the mainline majority interpretation of the Westminster Confession. So there are those who would debate that what I'm presenting is not Reformed theology. However, those perspectives would be the minority perspectives. And when you have a tradition that is divided in the way Reformed theology is, I'm going to do my best to represent the majority perspective. So, as far as baptism is concerned, what is, just briefly speaking, the Reformed view of baptism? Well, the Reformed view of baptism is not that baptism does nothing, but rather that baptism conveys certain covenantal promises, that it engrafts you into the covenant community of the visible church. And as a member of the visible church, you can then hear the word preached and receive the sacrament of the Lord's Supper. And these things will aid in the process of sanctification. However, it is also important to note that the Reformed do not believe that this effect of sanctifying grace, this covenantal sealing, that this is tied to the time of administration. So the positive effect of your baptism, which is not salvation, but is sanctifying, the positive effect of your baptism on, within the Reformed view may not happen at your baptism. And this for me was a really big issue, especially for someone who's baptized as an infant. I mean, what was the effect of my baptism as an infant? Has the grace of my baptism even been applied to me yet? Will I know when it happens? It takes an objective and beautiful sacrament and turns it into a subjective mess, if we're being frank. And that is the thing I appreciate the least about the Reformed view of baptism, is that it is subjective. It is not an objective sacrament wherein the individual being baptized is united to Christ, but rather it is a subjective outward sign of something that may or may not happen at a later date. Now, that's might not sound like the most charitable view on it, but that is the logical conclusion of the Reformed perspective. Now, the way my perspective changed on baptism was actually in reading a Reformed theologian, or a continental Reform theologian by the name of Martin Bucer. Now, Martin Bucer was a mentor to John Calvin, and many early Reformed theologians or continental theologians had no problem using the language of baptismal efficacy. And this is why there are the divisions there are today amongst Reformed people as to what the sacrament actually does. Because many of the earlier Reformers did speak in more Lutheran language on the issue. But I had never heard a Protestant say that before. I was still a young Calvinist, maybe 16 or 17, and I had never heard a Protestant say, baptism saves. But in Bucer, I found that. And to defend his position, he didn't just cite scripture, but he also cited St. Ambrose. Wanting to learn from the people that I'm learning from, the people that impact who I read, I went to St. Ambrose myself and I started reading anything I could find by St. Ambrose. St. Ambrose did a beautiful job of explaining how the sacrament of holy baptism has a real effect, and that real effect is salvation, right? And he didn't just show this from New Testament texts, but St. Ambrose also shows this from the typology of the Old Testament. And in that same work on baptism, which helped in changing my view to the Lutheran perspective, he also addressed the Lord's Supper. And he didn't hold back from calling it the body and blood of Christ for our salvation. This, at the time, I was much more uncomfortable with than what he was saying about baptism. At the same time, I was also continuing to read Martin Bucer. I was impressed with his stance on baptism, and so I wanted to get more of his writings. Now, not a lot of his work was available in English, but I went and tried my best to find anything I could from Bucer in English. And what I found was that some of Martin Bucer's later works, for example, his book on the reign of Christ, which he wrote when he was sick and older, sounded very Catholic. They sounded very, very Catholic. He would speak unabashedly about the body and blood of Christ being received by the faithful for the forgiveness of their sins. And in defense of that, he would cite St. John Chrysostom, who spoke about wanting to spill his own blood, then wrongly give the sacrament to someone else. And this made me think, maybe I don't have a proper view on the Lord's Supper. Now, the standard Calvinistic view of the Lord's Supper is that in the Lord's Supper, there is a spiritual feasting on Christ. But this spiritual reception of Christ excludes Christ's humanity. So even when you see Reformed theologians like John Calvin, his sacramental works are right here, when he speaks about receiving the body and blood of Christ in a spiritual manner, it's kind of this weird doublespeak, because he's actually saying you receive the body and blood of Christ according to Christ's divinity. Well, this is very confusing language. Christ's divinity does not have a body, does not have blood, right? And so you get into this weird place where you're using union language related to the union of the natures in the one person of Christ. And you use the union language to exclude a nature being present in the Eucharist. And yet they still attempt to hold on to the language of body and blood, because that is what the language the church has always used. And so the Calvinist view on the Lord's Supper, that you only receive Christ's divinity in the Lord's Supper, became a big problem for me. Because when I read the Fathers, they spoke of receiving Christ's body and blood. When I would read the New Testament, I would see this visceral language of receiving Christ's body and blood put so clearly, almost to prevent against people who would say it is only symbolic or only a spiritual reception. And so, through reading the scriptures in line with the Fathers, I came to the perspective that the Presbyterian view on the Lord's Supper was well-intentioned, but was insufficient. And as I continued to study Lutheran theologians and in the study of the Fathers over the years, I became more and more concerned about the Christological implications of the Reformed view. Now, I certainly don't think Reformed people are heretics or Nestorian or anything like that, but I think the theology of the Lord's Supper shows an imprecision with Reformed Christology. And I have videos that I've done previously addressing some of these topics in greater depth. So everything I'm saying here is just kind of a quick glance. So I was more convinced by the Lutheran view that in the supper we objectively receive Christ's body, blood, soul, and divinity for the forgiveness of sins. I thought that that view was more biblical, and I thought that the fathers seemed to have agreement on this issue. Even though there's some debate with some language in Tertullian, for the most part, we have a consensus. And even on the points where it seems like we wouldn't, those things are still being debated in academic circles and are not in any way settled. So, as far as the sacraments were concerned, I was now in a place where I was convinced that the Reformed faith was wrong on baptism and the Lord's Supper. And I was shocked because nobody seemed to care. The sacraments seemed to be something we gave lip service, but not something we actually loved, not something we actually adored, not something we actually reverenced. And so I noticed this lack of a sacramental faith. And Lutheranism presented that in a clear way. The other thing that did change over time was my view of the doctrine of election. I went from being a Calvinist to an Augustinian. And so, even though many Calvinists would argue they are a logical extension of the Augustinian thought, I just personally would disagree with them. But over time, my views on the sacraments changed. So did my view on election. Now, I still have a very high view of election, but I do reject the doctrine of limited atonement, that Christ only died for the elect. But rather, I believe in a universal scope of redemption, that Christ died for all, but that, the enduring salvation is only granted to the elect. And then I would also say, as an Augustinian, there are those who are given aorist faith, where God grants them to believe for a time and then permits them to fall away. So I believe that people can fall away from the faith. I don't believe in the Calvinist doctrine of perseverance of the saints. I believe that Christ died for all men, women, and children, not just certain people within different groups, right? So I believe that there is a true universal scope of the redemption of Christ's death, burial, and resurrection. I do not believe in a particular redemption, but a universal atonement. And so that does not mean that I reject the doctrine of election, but rather I uphold the doctrine of election as the Western Church has taught it since the time of Augustine. I believe that the elect will endure unto the end, that God will grant them the grace of perseverance. I believe that no elect person will die and fall. But the way I define what an elect person is slightly different. And the way we describe the extent of the atonement and the perseverance of the saints is also slightly different. So I love my Calvinist brothers and sisters, and I respect their love for God's providence and for his grace in election. But I think they take that a little too far, and that their theology and imbalance on that one point leads them into issues with their sacramental theology. So why Lutheran? There are many other Protestant groups, classical Protestant groups, who have some of the things I've talked about, who are sacramental, very much so, and yet they have confessions and they are Augustinian in their doctrine of election. Some of you may know where I'm going with this. Why not Anglican, right? Why not be a very high church like Anglo-Catholic, right? And it's because of a couple reasons, but the main reason is because of the confession. Now, Anglicans are often made fun of because of how broad their confession can be, how many different interpretations of the 39 articles there are. And within Lutheranism, we have this here big thing, the Book of Concord. And the Book of Concord is very long. It's comprised of many documents. and it's very precise in its theology. Now, it doesn't answer everything. There are some matters of opinion, even within Lutheranism, even in Catholicism and all these other groups, there are still some matters of opinion. But on essential points of theology, like baptism and the Lord's Supper and election, there is a standard, okay? There is a precise standard. However, within Anglicanism, there is a range of opinions that can be faithfully held. Now, Anglicans will still argue that their particular stance is more in line with their formularies, but most of them would not say that the Calvinist views ought to be rejected as non-Anglican. And so that is kind of the issue. Is my main issue with one of my many issues I had with my original Presbyterian upbringing is that there was no decision on many of these issues, many of these central issues. I felt as if there was openness to things there shouldn't have been any question about. This is kind of a mean joke, and there's this is kind of harsh, but the joke I always make is, a Catholic, a Pentecostal, and a Presbyterian walk into a bar. They were all Anglican, So it's kind of this thing where we have this broad theological tradition, which has guardrails and it has things that it does not permit to be believed. You cannot be a Pelagian and be Anglican. You cannot be what is it? You cannot believe in purgatory and be Anglican. But you can pray to the saints or not pray to the saints, or you can hold a Lutheran view of the Lord's Supper or a Reformed view of the Lord's Supper. You can't really hold a Zwinglian view, praise God. But it does not limit our theology or constrain our theology as much, the 39 Articles don't, as much as the Book of Concord does. Now, many Anglicans are Anglican because they love that. They like the freedom that their confession gives them. That's fine. I'm happy they love that. For example, I believe Barely Protestant Father James talks about why he enjoys that. And that's fine. But for me personally, I was tired of the church, going to the church and asking, what is the answer here? And being given 3 different answers, or even 2 different answers on essential questions. So the unity of the confession that Lutheranism put forward in how it defended the things I had come to love in a way Anglicanism didn't is one of the main reasons I became Lutheran rather than Anglican. And this doesn't mean I don't love my Presbyterian and Anglican brothers and sisters. But I was not going to leave a Presbyterian church just to go to an Anglican church up the road where many people have different perspectives, and where I'm going to run into a priest who might have a Calvinist view on the Lord's Supper when I actively and vehemently reject that perspective. And that same minister could be in line in a confessional Anglican body with another minister up the road who is basically a Roman Catholic without a pope. And so this is not me trying to bash Anglicans, because I love Anglicans. I especially love their desire for liturgy and for beauty. And I think that they take the sacraments a little more seriously than Continental Reformed and your standard Presbyterians do. But there's a reason I didn't become Anglican, and it's because I could not stomach the broad sense in which their theology functions. It just rubs me the wrong way. And again, many of them love Anglicanism for that very reason, and that's fine. That's okay. But for me, I need, especially on issues of sacraments and election, I need lines drawn in the sand. I need precision on those issues. So I did not become Anglican for that reason, but instead became a Lutheran. Not that Lutheranism doesn't have issues that Anglicanism doesn't in regards to ecclesiology, because American Lutheran ecclesiology is to be frank, painful. um, so so there's that. The last thing I'm going to, well, two last quick things, is beauty. So this is kind of a point against Presbyterianism that is not really a point as much against Anglicanism, but beauty. It matters to me that worship be beautiful. If we look at the Old Testament, the worship was beautiful. They chanted. They had images, surprisingly enough. They had images of angels in the temple. They had beautiful art. They had gold. They had silver. They had beauty. And we kind of have fallen into this weird thing in modern Christianity where we think that having something beautiful makes it Catholic, which is then bad. And this is just kind of, it's kind of Gnostic. Kind of this idea that the physical can't be beautiful. Something being physical and beautiful is bad. And we just kind of have to stay in these wooden churches with a cross, and we just kind of all very plain worship, so that we don't fall into idolatry because we have an image of St. Peter on the wall. And I don't see this type of worship in the Old Testament. I certainly don't see it in the early church. I don't think we can really argue that within that context of the Old Testament being liturgical and the after the New Testament being explicitly liturgical, that the apostles were just kind of doing church as Presbyterians do, or as Continental Reformed or Baptists do. They were liturgical. Maybe they didn't have all the smells and bells that we do. Maybe their incense wasn't, maybe they didn't have incense. But the way that they would have structured the services, the way they would have conducted themselves with reverence and the desire for beauty, that would have been there, right? Even if they didn't have the ability to express it as much as they may have wanted to, Christians have always desired beautiful worship. We have always maintained the tradition of chanting the Psalter. We've always maintained liturgy. That is something Christians have never thrown out, except for a few sons of the Reformation and their splinter groups. So one of the reasons I chose Lutheranism is because Lutheran liturgy is beautiful. And this is one of the things the Anglicans have over the Presbyterians, is their liturgy is just more beautiful. And if there were any reason to be an Anglican, it is because of the prayer book tradition and the beauty of their liturgy. But I love Lutheran liturgy. The music, I mean, we have Bach, right? I mean, good luck getting anything as good as Bach. But we have just beautiful music, beautiful prayers, beautiful liturgy. Even Lutheran art. Some of the Lutheran art I've seen, I do really, really like. Not all of it's great, but a lot of it I do really like. And so there is a sense in which when we come to worship, we are doing something important. And so what we are doing when we administer the sacraments is something that is important, something that is life-giving. And so our worship should be beautiful and, in a sense, even grandiose because of what it is that is happening in worship. We are in the very presence of God. Okay, that is not something that is to be taken lightly. And so I think that that worship as the ideal for worship should be beautiful worship. And when we can't have certain vestments, or we don't have certain incense or whatever, um, we should mourn those things. We should mourn when our worship isn't beautiful. But of course, when we don't have the financial ability to do certain things, we should try and be patient with ourselves, not be too harsh on churches who are a little different liturgically. But overall, the pursuit of beauty in Christian worship is something that is just inconsistent, for the most part, with iconoclasm and Presbyterian theology. And then the last thing, and I'm putting this last because it kind of is not the least important, but just kind of the last thing in the stage of my conversion to Lutheranism, the way we treat the saints. So, and this can, some of the things I'm going to critique Presbyterianism on here is a mistake that um, Lutherans and Low Church Anglicans can make also. But the way we treat the saints, the way we treat the saints in Reformed circles, the way the theology promotes how we approach the saints, compared to what Lutheranism teaches about how we approach the saints, is entirely different. Now, this doesn't mean there are not Reformed people who have a more Lutheran understanding on this point, but it does mean for the vast majority of Reformed people, for the vast majority of Presbyterianism, the saints are kind of given a nod, but they're not adored. They're not loved. Um, to say, for a Reformed person to say, I love the Virgin Mary deeply, that would offend, that would upset, and in some Lutheran circles it might also, which it shouldn't based on our theology. But in many Lutheran circles, and in line with the theology of our confessions, that is a holy and pious thing to say. Doesn't mean that we pray to Mary, doesn't mean that we have the same practices that Rome does. But when it comes to the saints, we don't just give them a head nod and say, yeah, we respect you. No, we have feast days for them. In our prayer books, we reflect on them. We read their writings. We reflect on their writings. They are integrated into our daily prayer life. Just the other day, maybe 2 or 3 days ago, we were Treasury of Daily Prayer had a prayer about a martyr who was killed in England for his Lutheran faith. And in the prayer following the telling of his life story, or the telling of his martyrdom, in that prayer, we are thanking God for this martyr, and then we are also asking God to give us the confidence and faith of the martyrs. I've never heard of that in a Reformed circle. It may happen in some, but that's not really consistent with their theology. That would be too close to idolatry, right? Too close to Romanism for the most part. So the way we approach the saints in our spiritual life is different. Now, there's a reason Lutherans don't approach the saints in the way Rome does, but we don't discard them from our walk with the Lord. I mean, we teach that the saints pray for us in heaven. The saints pray for you every day. Lutherans even teach that you have a guardian angel. I mean, these sound very much like Catholic things, but these are Lutheran theological convictions, right? And so even though in the modern era, not everyone who is claiming to be a Lutheran is as Lutheran as they ought to be, the faith as it is put forward by the Lutheran tradition takes the lives of the saints much more seriously. It takes their witness and their writing much more seriously, and it incorporates their witness into our prayer life and into our spiritual reflection. And that's baked into the way the church functions. It's baked into the calendar. There's a reason we have feast days. There's a reason we have the liturgy structured as we do. It is for a variety of theological reasons, for structure's sake, for the way the church works with the readings and things of that nature. But it is also for the feast days. There's a reason the feast days are where they are. And so the way the Lutherans approach incorporating the saints into their devotional life is entirely different. And that also relates to how images are used in the church also, which we touched a little bit on when we spoke about liturgy. Okay, so those are the kind of the main reasons why I left Presbyterianism for Lutheranism. The sacramentology I did not think was biblical or Catholic. The view on election, I did not think was biblical or Catholic. The liturgy is certainly neither biblical nor Catholic, even though there are obviously certain biblical elements to the way they do liturgy with their emphasis on the Psalms. Their view on the saints um, at times can be downright disrespectful, um, and create in the heart bitterness towards holy people, especially Mary. This is not me saying all Presbyterians are this way, but um, the way that many Reformed people speak about Our Lady is very, very problematic. And we'll all have to answer for that someday. But I do love my Reformed brothers and sisters. And within the Reformed scope of things, I certainly have a special appreciation for Anglicanism in a way I don't for more low church Reformed perspectives. But these are just my personal opinions. These are my personal reasons for leaving the Presbyterian Reformed faith for what I believe is a proper expression of Catholic Christianity. So that is why I'm a Lutheran. So I hope you guys got something from the video. I think I ran a little longer than I wanted to. If you disagree with anything, feel free to comment that down below. I'd be happy to talk to you about it. But yeah, so thank you guys for watching. Please like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one. Bye.